Hello, everybody. We're here at the Exeter TV studio, and I'm interviewing Stephen Briden, who's a Democratic candidate for the Rockingham County Attorney job. Stephen is a current Deputy Director of the Carroll County Attorney's Office. And he's been there since 2017. And we're going to have a question and answer period so that you will get to know him a little bit better. So welcome, Steve.
How you doing?
I'm well, thank you. Steve, would you please tell us a bit more about yourself, where you were born, where you grew up, your education background, your personal story, family, etc.?
Sure. So I was born in Massachusetts, but I've lived in Exeter since I was 5 years old. My parents moved up here for work when I was in the first grade. So I'm a graduate of Main Street and Lincoln Street, the Cooperative Middle School, and then the Exeter High School. And then, after high school, I'd actually decided that I wanted to be a musician. So I went to the University of New Hampshire and I studied saxophone and music education. And that was a great experience, and what I learned from that was that I was a pretty good saxophone player by Exeter standards and okay by New Hampshire standards, but that I wasn't going to cut it in New York as a gigging jazz musician, and so I kind of needed to figure out what I was going to do with the rest of my life. And so at that point I was working at a local car dealership in Exeter as a way to make money, and I decided that I wanted to try to make the switch into a legal career. So I got a paralegal certificate from Boston University, and I was lucky enough to get hired on at a law firm in Durham to work as a paralegal for a few years. And then at the same time I was doing that, I had become very interested in local politics, and so I had run for state representative in Exeter, and I was elected in 2012 and served one term in the legislature. And while I was in the legislature, I realized that I think what I really wanted to do was help kind of interpret these laws and try to find a way to make sure that we were enforcing the laws the way that we should. And that was what ended up with me going to law school. So I'm also a graduate from the UNH School of Law in Concord. And after I graduated from law school, I ended up working for then Governor Hassan in her office in Concord. I worked as a staff attorney, and I did some citizen services work there as well. And then when she was elected to go to Washington, D.C. as a senator, I ended up heading up to the Carroll County Attorney's Office to work as a prosecutor. And then over the time there, I've been promoted to Deputy County Attorney, and that's where I am today. A lot of my family still lives in the area. My parents still live in Exeter. I had been married to my wife, Kaylee, for about 7 years. She is a teacher. She studied, that's how we met, in music class at UNH. And she has been a teacher of really all things music. She's been an orchestra teacher. She was a choir teacher at Manchester Memorial for I think about 4 years. And then she just recently went to Boston University to get her master's degree. And then she's back out into the workforce now, but unfortunately she came back out into the pandemic. So she's been trying, I think like a lot of people have, to figure out how to get back into the workforce. Considering some of the limitations that everybody has faced over the last few months.
Sure. I'm intrigued about your work with Senator Hassan now. Tell me a little bit about what you did. You said constituent services. What was it like?
Sure. So it was a really great experience. So I actually started there as an intern when I was still in law school. And as an intern, I shadowed her legal counsel. Okay. And so I had an opportunity to do things like reviewing legislation that had been proposed and that was being voted on. I was working on different contracts and investigations the governor's office is a part of, just due to its position in the state government. And then I also helped with right-to-know requests, public information requests. And then, I decided that I really wanted to continue working there. And so when I graduated, they gave me an opportunity to basically fill split roles in the office. So as a constituent services representative, I was basically the person, if you called and you had a question about any kind of legal issue, environmental issue, or educational policy issue, I was the person that you talked to for about an entire year. Yeah, and just answered questions, helped try to get them information about programs that were available to help them, or try to get them connected with somebody else in the state government who could help them. And then at the same time, I was also doing staff attorney work, which involved kind of a continuation of what I was doing in my internship. So helping with right-to-know requests. I sat in a lot of the executive council meetings to help if there were any legal questions that came up during those. And then I would also do things like review requests for pardons, commutations, and then also requests for extraditions and renditions. So people who had been charged with crimes elsewhere and needed to be brought to New Hampshire, or the reverse, people who had been charged with crimes elsewhere and needed to be sent from New Hampshire.
Sounds like a great background for the county attorney position. You covered a lot of different issues and saw a lot of different sorts of legal approaches to things.
Yeah, it was definitely a nice primer for being able to come over to the county attorney's office, because I had seen how some of that top level stuff worked from the governor's office, and I also got a chance to interact with a lot of folks at the attorney general's office. And reviewing pardons, you get to see a lot of information about the prosecution and enforcement of prior cases, and trying to look at that. And ultimately, when you're looking at a pardon, you're trying to make an assessment of whether there was some kind of injustice done, whether there were procedural issues in how the case was handled, and try to figure out whether or not that would be something that would make the case need to be raised again. Mm-hmm. So it was definitely something that was a nice introduction to being able to work in the criminal side of the legal community in New Hampshire.
Yeah, cool. Steve, ever since I've known you, you've been involved in the political process. Why is that? And did you come from a political family? Is politics just a part of your passion for life?
So I don't come from like a actively political family. I'd say both of my parents are engaged in that they follow politics a lot. I think they were a little surprised when I decided that I wanted to engage a little more actively. But for me, it was always, I have a hard time looking at a problem and saying it should just be somebody else's issue to fix it. I've always felt like as a member of the community, I should be doing what's within my power to try to address issues that I see going out about my daily life. So at some points in my life, that's led me to volunteering for campaigns. Some points it's led me to being a candidate myself. And then that's part of why I'm passionate about being a prosecutor now, is prosecutors have an incredible amount of power in the justice system to make sure that the right thing is done. Mm-hmm. And if it's wielded by people who are more concerned with personal glory or getting good results in the newspaper, you can end up with results that actually really negatively impact the community and certainly negatively impact the lives of folks. So it's that same desire that leads me to want to work in this field and make sure that I'm doing what's within my power to make sure that when my cases are over, the community is improved, if possible, from the result.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Steve, what hobbies or what non-work activities do you have or participate in? And another question related to this is any interesting books or movies that you've read or seen lately?
Sure. So, when I'm not working as a lawyer, I love video games. I grew up with video games. I still play them. One of the fun things about one of the side effects of the pandemic has been that I've actually become closer with some of my high school friends. Mm-hmm. And we've gone back to playing some games that we used to play as high school as like a way to reconnect and engage.
And these are virtual games.
Yeah, exactly. We're playing over the internet, and you put a little Zoom connection up so you can all see and talk to each other while you do it. But it's a way to still feel engaged with people when we're actually isolated all the time.
Sure.
I'm also a big sports fan. I love the Patriots. I'm excited that they were able to find a way to bring football back as safe as they've been able to. It's still not perfect, but it is nice to have that distraction. And I've been very excited about Cam Newton so far. I think he's doing great.
You must have heard about the recent fines that 2 coaches got over the weekend.
Yeah, I noticed that during the first week of the broadcast that some coaches were really bad about keeping their masks up, and it seemed like the NFL noticed as well. It's one of the things that's been unfortunate because my dad grew up in South Central Massachusetts, and he's been a Patriots season ticket holder since the early 1980s, since before they got good for the first time in the mid-80s. And so he's been going to games for almost 40 years now.
Yeah.
And I've been going since I think I went to my first game when I was 5 years old. And we're not going this year for the first time for my dad in 40 years, the first time for me since I really have a memory of it.
Yeah.
And so it's an kind of unfortunate side effect of what's happening. It's nowhere near as serious as the folks who've become ill or have lost loved ones to it. But it's kind of a sign of how the reverberations to the community affect everybody. So it's unfortunate.
Yeah.
And then, in terms of books or movies that I've seen recently that I've really enjoyed, I kind of read two very different types of books. I love nonfiction biographies, especially political biographies, but I prefer people from further in the past. I don't read a lot of biographies of current folks, but I read a biography of Henry Clay, who was a legislator in the 1800s and somebody who isn't well known but is very influential.
Was he South Carolina or?
Yeah, and just how the government changed in the mid 1800s, and how individuals impacted that. I thought was very interesting. And then when I'm not doing that, I'm somebody who really enjoys sci-fi and fantasy. And I've been, I listen to audiobooks a lot because I commute up to Ossipee for work. So I'm in the car, 3 hours a day, most days. So, whatever the newest, kind of sci-fi audiobook that I can find, I always try to listen to that.
I think I shared with you one of the most significant legal films I'd ever seen was 12 Angry Men.
Yeah.
It's a whole drama in the court, not in the courtroom specifically, but in the chambers where the jury has to decide on the guilt or innocence of this person. It's such an amazing movie, black and white, and it has a host of really top-notch actors that were part of it. Of course, they're all male, but that's the way it was. Please tell viewers a bit about your understanding of the job of a county attorney. You obviously know what it's all about since you work for one. Why is it an important position?
Sure, I think that's a really important question because I think a lot of people really don't realize what it is that the county attorney does. I always find it easiest to refer people to, if you watch Law & Order or other TV shows, you hear about district attorneys. It won't surprise people to know that New Hampshire loves to be different from everywhere else. So what everywhere else in the country, for the most part, would call your district attorney, New Hampshire calls a county attorney. But really, they are the person that, for the county, they are responsible for criminal prosecutions almost exclusively. So they handle, sometimes local police departments will handle violation level offenses, traffic tickets, that kind of stuff, and some misdemeanor offenses. But every low-level felony offense, so starting with your drug possessions and thefts, all the way up to really significant offenses like child sex abuse, aggravated felonious sexual assault, negligent homicide, manslaughter, those are all handled by the county attorney's office. Really everything short of intentional murder, which goes to the Attorney General's office, and then some very specific sections of crime like election crimes, some public integrity crimes, and elder abuse go to the Attorney General as well. But if you're somebody that is somebody who's passionate about criminal justice reform, or somebody who thinks that we need to take a different look at how we handle issues like that, you really should be looking in New Hampshire at what your county attorneys do. Prosecutors have an incredible amount of discretion in the criminal justice system. They are the people that make requests for bail. So trying to figure out whether or not somebody gets released pre-trial, that's a decision that starts with the prosecutor. And ultimately, the judge has the final say. But if you have the right person in that prosecutor role and they're making those determinations the right way, you don't necessarily need a judge to be a brake on the system. Right. They're also the people that decide what the plea offer in a case is going to be. So if you have prosecutors who aren't willing to look at whether or not there should be different ways to handle cases, different treatment or rehabilitation options, and are only pursuing incarceration, you're going to see a lot higher incarceration numbers in that county. So ultimately, a county attorney race is extremely important if you're interested in addressing any of the kind of systemic issues that have really come out over the last year, but have been present for really the entirety of American history.
Sure.
But things like over-incarceration, of certain groups of people, and then just inequities in the justice system where people who have means end up having much different outcomes than people who don't.
You raise a point in my mind about for-profit prisons. Do we have any for-profit or for-profit-like prisons in New Hampshire?
I don't believe so. And that legislators in New Hampshire have done a good job, I think, trying to make sure that it stays that way. Some of our jails, which are our jails and prisons, which are run by the state or county, depending on the level, in the state of New Hampshire, they do take contracts from other organizations. For instance, the Stratford County House of Corrections takes federal inmates and things like that. So it's not necessarily just people from New Hampshire that's in these institutions, but our houses of corrections are all run by our county governments, and our state prisons are all run by the Department of Corrections at the Department of Safety.
Do you have a personal opinion about the concept of for-profit prisons?
I don't like the idea of profit being involved in the criminal justice system, especially on the state side. It makes me very uncomfortable. We should really be focused on making sure that people who are incarcerated have access to things that they need in order to better themselves. Yeah. And that's really a community responsibility. And I don't think it's a responsibility that we should be abdicating to private corporations whose ultimate responsibility is to their shareholders to make money, and their responsibility is not to the community that they're operating in, to make sure that when people leave their facility, they're leaving their facility with tools that they didn't have when they came in there.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. So tell the voters why you're running as a Democratic candidate for Rockingham County Attorney. Is there something, maybe some issue associated with the current county attorney that you feel needs some attention or corrective action?
I think the biggest thing is we need a philosophy change in prosecution. I think for a long time in this country, especially since the advent of the war on drugs, there has been a really strong focus on retribution in the criminal justice system. This concept that this person has done something wrong, they should be punished for it, and that punishment should be serious. You talk about people wanting to see others do hard time, they want prisons and jails to be uncomfortable.
Some would bring back the chain gangs where you're splitting rocks on the side of the road.
Yeah, and I think what we need to realize as a community is that that's not an effective way to handle the system. And that's not me saying that there aren't individuals who deserve to be incarcerated. I have incarcerated people as a prosecutor. I think that people who commit acts of violence against other people, I think you do need to incarcerate them. But the idea that, in my current job in the Carroll County Attorney's Office, well over half of our caseload has to do with substance misuse. So either possession of drugs, sale of drugs, or a theft or burglary case, but when you look beyond the charge, you see an individual breaks into a house, steals whatever they can grab to go take to the pawn shop to go buy drugs with it. Yeah. And so we're expending an incredible amount of resources on it. And I think the problem is we don't know what the end game to that is. Yeah. You hear politicians a lot and people in law enforcement talk about, they say like you can't arrest your way out of the opioid crisis, but that doesn't mean anything if you don't put something behind it. Yeah. And what has to be behind it is a real commitment from law enforcement, from prosecution, and from state legislators to say, we want to stand up treatment and rehabilitation facilities for people with substance misuse disorder, and we're going to be serious in our commitment to when those people interact with the justice system, trying to find a way to redirect them to those treatment facilities instead of incarcerating them. I think we look at things in the nature that maybe we looked at alcohol. We're like, okay, we'll put them in the jail for 2 weeks, dry them out, and send it back out into the world. Now, people who actually deal with alcohol treatment knows that that actually doesn't work for alcohol either, right. But it certainly doesn't work for things like opioids because there's a tremendous change in your brain chemistry that happens due to opioid dependence, and that's not something that you can deal with just by forced sobriety. You actually have to have legitimate opportunities to connect with people who know what they're doing on the treatment side to help you talk through it, help you identify your triggers, and help you find a way to stay away from it in the future. And so looking at this race, the current county attorney has talked about these issues, but at the end of the day, I don't think the actions really back up the words. And I think we really need to see that shift. Also, when it comes to mental health issues, we criminalize mental health issues.
Right.
And that's not a New Hampshire problem or a Rockingham County problem. That's I would say to some extent, a worldwide problem, but certainly a problem in the United States, where, 50 years ago, we institutionalized people with mental health issues, and that was wrong. And we acknowledged that it was wrong. And so we said, what we want to do is get them into community-based treatment. But there was never the economic push to actually make sure that we had enough community-based treatment. It was funded and supported in a way to actually handle all the people that needed to go there. And so what you see is you have people who are in crisis, and they do things like go to a hospital. They get in a fight at a hospital, they destroy things, and hospitals do the only thing they can do, they call the police. Mm-hmm. And then the police officers come, and what they have are crimes. I mean, by the letter of the law, there's certainly crimes. A lot of times those scenarios end up with physical confrontations between these people and police officers, which also are crimes. But then we're faced with that same solution again, where now you've arrested a person, and you put them in the House of Corrections, and we have some houses of corrections that really do try, but that's just not the best treatment facility for any person who's mental health issues. That confinement, that isolation that's inherent in incarceration just isn't going to be effective from a treatment perspective. So, ultimately, as a county attorney, I would look at those two groups of crimes and say, my job is to make sure that I'm redirecting those people into the treatment programs that they need so that they can get back to being productive members of the community. And then I want to use those resources to make sure we're focusing on the really serious crimes, like sexual and domestic violence, that have victims that suffer significantly due to those offenses. And I think if we find a way to do that and meet that balance in a better way than we've done it, we're going to end up with a healthier and safer community by far.
Are you able to give the New Hampshire legislature a grade in terms of how supportive they've been for the kinds of progressive programs that you think might be helpful in the law enforcement and justice system?
Well, I think the tough thing there is that New Hampshire is proud of its local control.
Right.
And so it cedes a lot of decisions down to local policymakers, which means that you have incredibly different access to treatment, access to justice, depending on where you live. Right. If you commit a crime in Milton, New Hampshire, you get access to a lot of different opportunities in Stratford County Attorney's Office. They have things like DUI court to help people who are habitual drunk drivers. They have a well-functioning drug court. They have pretrial supervision services so that if you're somebody who may represent a danger or risk of flight, but not so serious that you need to be incarcerated pretrial, they can supervise you in a way that helps release more people back to the community. If you commit that same crime 2 miles further north, where I work in Carroll County, you have access to almost none of that. And so it would be great if the state legislature took some steps to try to even those out. But that's a situation we've seen that carries over into almost every aspect of New Hampshire, whether it's education or anything like that, where municipalities and counties that are really forward-thinking and making investments to have great opportunities, like the Exeter High School here. Exeter's always been committed to funding education, and we've always had a well-performing public high school as a result of that. It's not any different in the criminal justice system. They did, a few years ago, they put forward a bill to make drug courts available in every county, and they did that with state funding, and I think that was great, especially for the more rural counties where, it's harder to keep the population numbers as high as you would in a place like Rockingham, where there are always going to be more people who could be in a drug court than we have seats to hold them. Yeah. So having that statewide support is good. So, I think that there's been a really big push in the last, kind of truncated session due to COVID-19. There was a lot of push on criminal justice reform, which I think was good. And so I'm hopeful that momentum is going to carry over into when the legislature is able to work on some of these issues more fully. And I hope they work with prosecutors and defense attorneys across the state to say, where are the best places we could invest money to make sure we had a fairer system?
Name a different kind of approach here. Name 3 people, living or dead, whom you respect or have high regard for in connection with our legal system.
So it's an interesting question. As I said before, I kind of have an affinity for some folks who are more involved in the founding of institutions. So I'll take it from the people who have passed away angle to the question. But I think you can't look at the legal system in New Hampshire and not be interested in John Marshall, who wasn't, some people think he was the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He wasn't, but he was the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court that mattered.
I thought he was, actually.
Well, so essentially until John Marshall took over the Supreme Court, it didn't really operate the way that we think of the Supreme Court operating. It was not considered a particularly prestigious post. John Jay was the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he left to, I think, be the governor of New York. And that was considered an upward move for him at the time. And a lot of those judges were not really permanently on the Supreme Court. They called them riding circuit. They would be kind of in and out. And John Marshall was the first one to look at the Supreme Court as a reviewer of the laws, that the concept of judicial review.
Yeah.
And I think that for a very large part of our country, that's been a really important principle that has helped rein in some of our worst impulses, although not always. There's certainly lots of examples in the past of the Supreme Court doing things that I think most of us would find.
Plessy Ferguson?
Yeah, in Korematsu, the decision about incarcerating Japanese American citizens that are reprehensible. But there have been other times where knowing that exists, I think has been a really positive influence on the legislature. So I think he's a fascinating person who, his view, in every way, I think he's really a founding father. He's just one that gets overlooked a little bit because of, his was not so much as a part of the revolution and the writing of the Constitution, but in the interpretation of the Constitution.
Yeah, interesting.
Another person that I find fascinating is Robert Jackson. So he was a Supreme Court justice during the 20th century.
Was he involved in the prosecution of?
He was.
Of the Nazis?
Yeah. So he was a Supreme Court justice who left to go be a part of the Nuremberg prosecution, which is, that's a whole fascinating story in amongst itself. There's a great movie about that. It's Trials at Nuremberg or something like that. Definitely worth the time for anybody who's interested in world history or just a really fascinating story. But he is also somebody who helped craft what the edges of presidential power should be. So when he was on the Supreme Court, he wrote a very influential decision about when the president can act without the authority of the legislature. And it was all based on the nationalization of certain industries during war. And basically, his stood for the principle of, if the president's acting in line with what the legislature has already said, then that's going to be a place where the president's power is strong. But if he is
wrong, you say
strong.
Strong.
So if the legislature says, we really want you to do X, Y, and Z, and the president's like, yep, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, then you're going to be in a good place. But the other piece of that decision is if you're trying to take executive action in the place that the legislature has specifically chosen not to act, then you're going to have a lot harder time doing that. And that's kind of been the guiding principle behind a lot of our executive authority, judicial review over the last, about 70 years or so since that came forward. So again, somebody who's very influential in shaping how the whole interpretation of the interaction of the branches of government is formed.
Certainly more important in current times.
For sure. I think it's made some of the more recent executive actions of the last 20 years much more interesting because I think we've seen a lot more attempts to have the president kind of legislate in the gaps left by the legislature than we may have seen in the past.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. That's great. Do you have any specific programs or plans that you would implement if you became Rockingham County Attorney?
Definitely. So some of it is just expansion of current programs. So Rockingham County does have a drug treatment court. And for people who don't know, because it's not obvious by what it's obvious it has something to do with drugs, but a lot of people don't realize what it's for.
Right.
So drug courts are actually for people who have significant history already in the justice system. So it's for people who, but for drug court, oftentimes would end up in the state prison. So it's people who have tried a lot of other things and failed. And instead of writing them off and just being like, all right, just go up to the state prison for 5 or 6 years and we'll worry about you then, drug court tries to bring them in. They meet multiple times a week, either with the judge, they meet with case managers from a treatment facility, they meet with individual licensed alcohol and drug counselors, LADACs, and really try to help them understand their substance misuse. They try to help them find ways to reconnect with the community in a good way. You know, they do community service, they get back to work, and they're prompted to do social givebacks. So go be part of a group, go be part of an organization that you believe in, so that people, because a lot of times these people feel really isolated by the community, and the only connections they have are people inside that drug world. And so building those bridges and being able to interact with law enforcement and the judiciary in a way that's positive as opposed to negative, which has been their entire life experience, can be really helpful. And in Rockingham County, the drug court exists. I think it could be much bigger. There's certainly the opportunity. There are plenty of people who would qualify for it. And one of the difficulties with drug court is a lot of people look at it and they just want to put in people whose charges are possession of drugs. But if you look at the research and you look at the statistics, the program is just as effective for people who are charged with sale of drugs. And that's not to say every person, if you're trafficking thousands of grams of heroin up from Massachusetts, I don't really want you in that program either. Right. But a lot of folks who are opioid dependent sell drugs because they have literally no other way to get money. And if the program can be effective for them, then it's also somebody that you should be considering putting in programs like this, because there's a ripple effect from that. If you're able to clean that person up, if you're able to bring them back to the community, not only are they not using, but they're also not distributing to other folks. Right. So that's a really good program from the law enforcement side to make sure that we're expanding and supporting. Also making sure that we're using pretrial supervision well, making sure we're not holding too many people pretrial. That really should be something that's reserved for people who represent a serious danger to the community. People accused of serious crimes of domestic, sexual, or physical violence, where that pretrial release, could endanger either the victim or other people. And we really shouldn't be using that for other types of offenses. We should only use it as a last resort. But then from the management side, inside the office, I also think it's important that we do implicit bias training for prosecutors. I think it's something, you've seen a lot of different groups talking about the need for this. It's one of the things that the Black Lives Matter Seacoast folks have asked of county attorney candidates. I think it makes a lot of sense. I am a white person who grew up in a very non-diverse area in Exeter. I grew up in a middle-class family. And so it's not for me to dictate how other people feel in society. It's for me to listen to their experiences and try to make sure that I'm making adjustments to what I do to make sure that they can feel in Exeter and Rockingham County the way that I've always felt there. And the whole point of an implicit bias is you don't realize that you're acting in a way that's incorrect. And so it's no attack on members of law enforcement or members of the prosecution to say it would be good to make sure that if we have any implicit biases that we're addressing them. So I think that that's something that you could do pretty early on that would give dividends, both in making sure you're being fair, but also in making sure the community understands that you acknowledge that.
I was looking at the particulars of county attorney and also just attorneys in general, and there are so many professional rules of conduct that attorneys have to go through. I'm looking at a few of them. Rule number 1.6, confidentiality of information. Rule number 1.7, conflicts of interest. 1.16, declining or terminating representation. 3.3, candor toward the tribunal, the court. 4.2, communication with persons represented by counsel. Rule 4.4, respect for the rights of third persons. So obviously, the whole idea of professional conduct is important, that you have an understanding with the people that work with you of what the rules are. It struck me that if you should ever confront a situation where one of your attorneys in the office had apparently violated some of these things, what procedure would you use? How would you go about addressing that?
So it's interesting. So I mean, a lot of these procedures are set, by the bar and by the state, and essentially, if you realize that there have been violations, you have a duty to make sure that those are handled, make sure they're reported, and then there's a whole review process that the bar does to make sure. And it's one of those things that I think kind of bleeds well into the questions people have had about law enforcement accountability. And we have kind of an ad hoc system in the state of New Hampshire where towns have a lot of control. There's police standards and training in Concord, and they set some kind of big umbrella guidelines.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it's the decision of individual departments, how they handle a lot of issues, and then also how they handle reviews of actions. Some people are familiar because it's been in the news a lot recently with the exculpatory evidence schedule, or the Lorry list. But basically what it is New Hampshire has a list of officers who have committed misconduct on the job, and that list is secret because it has to do with information in police officers' personnel files.
Right.
And there's been litigation at the Supreme Court about whether or not that list should be made public. And I think while that's a valuable discussion to be having, really the question should be, is the process that we have the right process? Because I think it's clearly not. I think you could have a much fairer process and a much more transparent process for everybody involved by doing something similar to what attorneys do, what doctors do, nurses and teachers, which is they can have a state board. We already have police standards and training. It would be relatively easy to build a board in there, to have individuals who have law enforcement backgrounds, attorneys, legislators, whatever, obviously the House of Representatives feels is the most appropriate group of people. But the idea would be, if there's an allegation of misconduct, instead of the process, which is right now, you go in front of your local chief, and they make a determination. That's a hard process, especially in a small department.
Yeah.
You're basically talking about one of the 5 people you work with every day having to make a decision about your long-term career. And that's an unfair position to put everybody in. So if you have a state board that's responsible for this, you get a referral. There are investigators attached to the state board, just like there are for doctors and attorneys. They look into it. If they find that it's unfounded, there's no public information that's given out. It's the same thing with an unfounded complaint against attorneys. They close the thing, but if it is founded, then those reports should be made public. Because that's one of the deals. When you work in a public position, if you screw up, you do tend to screw up publicly, and people hear about it. But I think it takes away a lot of the mistrust of the system. I think a lot of people assume that every police officer who's on that list has done something really, really bad. In my experience, that's not actually the case. I think there are a lot of places that have very different determinations of how you get on the list. And some people are on the list for things that most people would go like, that's really dumb. You lied about when you punched out at the time clock. Or you lied about the fact that you went to Dunkin' Donuts and so you were in line for 5 minutes. And that is a lie. It's a lie to your employer, and it's also a thing that almost everybody has done.
Yeah.
But it's the type of thing where, depending on your police chief, that could actually put you on this list.
Yeah.
And it puts you on the list with people who have done things that are really bad that the public should know about.
Right.
And I think having a fairer system where you have this administrative review board who could decide, based on the precedent of what's happening in other cases that are similar, you're going to end up with a system that's much fairer to officers. So you don't have officers getting on there for things that people really don't think are worthwhile.
Yeah.
But then also the public can be more confident that the police officers that are working in their community are the officers that I think they are, which are people who really just care about keeping the community safe, and people who want to make sure that they can stop some of the more serious abuses of the law.
You must be clairvoyant. You pretty much answered my next question. But I'll ask it anyway, because
Yeah.
it leads into another one. What are your views about our current prison system? the meting out of justice to our citizens and society, and our community police departments and their role in society. So,
Yeah.
do you have anything else you want to say about that?
Well, sure. I think this is where, kind of the idea of community policing comes in, which is something I think is really important. I think your most successful police departments are the ones that are most engaged with the citizenry outside of making arrests. And I think the philosophy behind that makes a lot of sense when you think about it. If your only interaction on a day-to-day basis with your community is arresting them when they've committed crimes, it's ultimately going to give you kind of a negative view of the community that you're working in. Right. And it's understandable. I don't think anybody would look at that and wonder how that would happen. In my job as a prosecutor, I handle mostly really serious cases. And some days it is, kind of a drag to come into work today and read about another case of abuse. So it's important that police officers are getting out and engaging in the community in a positive way, because it helps remind them that the community as a whole is good, and it also helps the community know that just because they see a police officer, they don't have to be like, oh man, was I speeding? Did I jaywalk? It's something that they don't see them as somebody who's out to get them. They see them as just Officer Johnson, who is always downtown. Yeah. Talking to folks down there. Maybe not right now with COVID, but when we come out the other side. And that applies to the way that we handle inmates in our justice system. There are going to be people who are incarcerated, but nobody really benefits from the dehumanization of incarcerated people. Yeah. They've done something wrong. The justice system has decided that the punishment is that they're going to be isolated from friends and family, and a lot of times for extremely good reason. But the idea that it has to be this kind of psychological punishment, I think, is one that is not helpful. Yeah. It is enough to be separated, to not have the ability to go take a walk outside, to not have the ability to call your loved ones when you want to. To not have the ability to go see the movie that you want to see. Like, those are real legitimate punishments that seriously lessen somebody's quality of life. Yeah. And I don't think it's necessary to, on top of that, do some of the things that our justice system is unfortunately, well known for. Round the clock isolation, yeah. Negative interactions with corrections officers, physical violence inside houses of corrections and prisons. So I think we can do what we need to do, and people will still be punished in a significant way, but we can do it in a way that's much more humane.
Great. Do you have a position on the apparent murder of numerous Black Americans at the hands of police in other parts of our country? And what are your thoughts about the cry to defund the police?
Yeah, I think it's a troubling, thing that we've seen. I think it only seems like it's a new problem because it's only a problem that has gotten national attention recently. But what these instances show me, more than anything else, is people like to say this is bad apples, yeah. And they certainly are. But I think it also shows that there are some questions about how we train, and whether that should be the way that we train. I think, essentially the message that's been given to law enforcement when they've been in training for the last, certainly the last 20 years or so, is this message of more militarization, of more aggressive interactions with the community members. And officers are trained that if you tell somebody they're under arrest and they're resisting, you have to use physical force to subdue them. I mean, that's not a decision that each officer is making. That's what they're told to do. And I think that if we want to get past this current moment in time, I think we need to have a conversation as a community about whether or not that's what we want the standard to be, or whether we want to try to put forward more of an effort to de-escalate before we get to those positions, so that you don't have officers in the middle of physical confrontations with folks where they have to make those split-second decisions that lead to, really abhorrent outcomes. Right. So it's one of those things where prevention comes from training and from being away from that situation entirely, so that you're not making those decisions there. And on the question of defund the police, I think it's important to look behind a slogan, mm-hmm. and see what it is that the folks are actually asking for, because I think there's been a lot of politicization of what exactly it is that means. But when you talk to folks and you listen to them, what they're saying is not all that different from what I think a lot of people in law enforcement feel, which is the lack of public resources for things like substance abuse and mental health issues has led to police officers being forced into those roles.
Right.
And police officers aren't social workers. That's not really what they want to be doing. A lot of them don't want to be drug counselors. They want to go out and they want to try to track down serious criminals who are committing serious crimes. So looking beyond that to say, I agree that we should be putting more money into making sure that we have the community supports necessary to help with these folks so that they don't have to have the interactions with our police officers in the first place. I happen to be somebody who thinks that there's a lot of domestic and sexual violence that exists that we're not necessarily finding because we're spending a lot of our time on issues like substance abuse and mental health issues. So I think that it's one of those things that we need the addition, and I'm not so sure we need the subtraction. But I think we need to fund those programs. And if in funding those programs we see a drop in in the necessity for having those same resources, for the police, then I think that's something we can talk about. But I think what we'll find is we'll actually have more time to treat those other serious crimes more effectively, and we'll find that we're going to get better outcomes in those cases if we're making sure our officers are spending our time there as opposed to with substance misuse and with mental health issues.
So do you see it as effectively a zero-sum game where if you spend money on the social aspect of combating problems, the police department gets fewer resources for their own training and other things, or?
I don't think it has to be that way.
Okay.
I mean, I think that as a community, we have to decide where to invest our money, and that's certainly finite. But I think when you look at the community costs in the long term, we're actually going to save community money by putting more money into treatment and rehabilitation, and actually in the long term, we're not going to be running those deficits because especially substance misuse is a huge negative driver on the economy. Yeah. Spending money incarcerating a lot of people is a huge negative driver on county budgets. So if you are removing those costs out of the system, I think you're still going to find that you have all the money that you need to make sure you have a robust police force, but also are going to have these extra services.
Do you happen to have a figure that relatively accurately represents what it costs to incarcerate somebody in our county jails?
From what I've found, that's a number it's very hard to get people to agree on. It changes very differently depending on how people count. It changes very differently on what county you're in and what level of confinement. But most people agree that we're talking about something that's north of $30,000, sometimes as much, depending on where you are, up to $80,000. In some states, it can be even more than that.
Per inmate?
Per inmate.
Yeah.
It's not cheap. I mean, you think about what you're doing. You're providing somebody all of their meals.
Right.
You're providing medical treatment.
Right.
Some people who are in jail are very healthy. Some people in jail are very unhealthy. So those averages get thrown off a little bit. If you have an inmate who's getting $150,000 a year in medical care, but that's not something that's unreasonable or unusual to have happen. Especially with you're dealing with folks with substance abuse issues. A lot of folks who have abused heroin, opioids, cocaine, methamphetamines end up having heart issues and things like that can be actually relatively expensive to address while confined.
Yeah. You've addressed some of this, but what are your thoughts about how we can combat drug addiction in our youth and the general population? And then next question, do you support the legalization of marijuana in New Hampshire?
So I think it's a really hard question about how to stop what we're in right now with opioids. I think we need a more coordinated response. It's one of those times where I think it actually calls on us to work together, and I actually think we need a little more government solutions than private-based solutions, because when the heroin opioid crisis first came to light in New Hampshire, you heard a lot of stories about how it was tied to overprescribing medication, which is definitely true.
Yeah.
And that's something that you can address that through regulation, and I wish a little more prosecution of some of the people who did that, but at least they've done it through civil cases. But now we're seeing the subsequent generations from those families. A lot of the folks that I deal with, they get hooked on these drugs when they're like 13 and 14 years old. And they're not getting hooked on marijuana and alcohol. They're getting hooked on prescription painkillers and heroin at that young age. And so they've had no opportunity to finish school, get an education. I have somebody in my drug court in Carroll County who talked about the fact that this person's now working in food service, and it was the first time that they have ever made money legally in their life. And this person is not 21 years old. And it's very hard for folks who have been in that situation since they were a child to break out. So we need to really, it's one of those things that requires like almost a public works type activity, like we saw with the New Deal, like people talk about now with environmental issues. We need to invest.
Works Progress Administration.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We need to make sure that we are making real serious investments, or we are going to lose generations of people. New Hampshire it's in this position. We talk about the youth leaving New Hampshire all the time. It's a common refrain in politics. And the piece of that we're missing is, yes, they're leaving, but the ones who are staying a lot of times are really compromised also. So especially some of these states that have seen a lot of population exodus combined with opioids, I think you're going to see that it's going to be really tough to have New Hampshire of 25 years from now that looks like New Hampshire of today if we don't make sure we're putting forward that effort to address it. And then on the issue of legalization of marijuana, I think you kind of have to look at it practically. It is legalized everywhere New Hampshire touches. New Hampshire has one of the highest per capita usages of marijuana, despite the fact that it is still technically illegal. But we've also created this really uncomfortable regulatory scheme where it's legal for medicinal use, decriminalized for personal possession below a certain amount. And I think that ultimately it makes it complicated. We're sending a mixed message. And ultimately, I think we do need to legalize marijuana. I think, we have found ways to regulate similar things. I think if you regulate marijuana in a way that's not too dissimilar from the way you regulate alcohol, I think we can still do everything you need to do from a law enforcement perspective in terms of making sure people aren't driving while they're high, just like we make sure people aren't driving while they're drunk. But you're creating a lot of people heading into the justice system for something that the public as a whole doesn't really feel is a problem. And when you have laws like that, unfortunately, those are the ones that I think you see the most discrepancy between how people who have limited means navigate those versus people who have serious means. I mean, if you are a 21-year-old kid who's coming up to New Hampshire to go to your parents' lake house and you get caught with marijuana on your drive up, that's not going to end with a really negative consequence for you most of the time. But if you are 21 years old and you're in Manchester and you are somebody who doesn't have access to a family lawyer to bail you out, or somebody who's of a group that isn't as somebody who is of a minority group of people, you might find that your outcome is different. And I think anytime you see that in a law, I think you should decide about whether or not that law needs to be changed.
In general terms, Steve, could you outline or explain the steps you'd take in prosecuting a case for court?
Sure. So cases come into prosecutors from police departments. So you get police reports, you get a description of what happened, and then at that point, you make your first decision is what should bail be in this case. In New Hampshire, we've done some bail reform. It used to be kind of a Wild West situation where a prosecutor would think, what amount of money seems right for this case? It wasn't really based on anything meaningful. It was like, this seems serious, so I'm going to set bail at $5,000. Or this doesn't seem serious, so I'm not going to set a cash bail. With the changes that we've seen, it makes it a little more of a binary question of, should this person, do they represent a danger to the public? And if the answer is no, they should be released on personal recognizance, which basically their promise to return to court when they're called. And if they are a danger to the public, then they're held preventatively, if the state can show that by clear and convincing evidence. And then the only place that falls in between are people who habitually don't show up to court. And then you have to make a determination about whether you need to put something additional an additional thing on them to make them come. And in my mind, you want to do everything you can short of putting a cash bail on somebody. But I do think at some point when you have somebody who's just refusing to engage in the system, that's one of the only tools we have to be like, look, you have to come or you'll have to forfeit $100 or you'll have to forfeit $200.
Yeah.
So after you make that bail determination, then you should be getting the complete case from a police department. You review everything, make sure that there are no violations. It's not so much looking for places where people have purposely violated rights, but a lot of times it can be a little complicated to make sure you're doing everything you're supposed to do.
Right.
And sometimes a police officer is really sure that you have drugs in the car, and they don't necessarily follow all the procedural steps they have to do. And you have to look at that case and make a determination about whether or not the steps that they skipped mean that you need to dismiss that case. And if you decide that you don't and you need to go forward, that's when you make a plea offer. As a prosecutor, I always try to look at plea offers as what is the best outcome that I can give to make sure that the community is safer and healthier at the end of it. Mm-hmm. So if this is somebody whose only interaction with me is because they have an opioid issue, then how can I redirect them into a treatment program? If it's somebody who is a chronic abuser of their partners or spouses, then my plea offer is going to be more along the lines of how do I separate them from society for a little while and try to show them that this is unacceptable conduct. Yeah. And then if your plea offer isn't accepted, that's when you get ready to go to trial. You have a trial on the merits, and if you're able to get a conviction, then you ask for an appropriate sentencing from the judge, and then you move on to the next case.
Mm-hmm. Good, thank you. Steve, would you like to comment on any of the national justice-related issues Americans face today? Gender equity, gender equality, discrimination, access to lawyers by poor defendants, the death penalty, our court system, local to national.
There's a lot of things in there, but I think one of the really important things to talk about is access to justice. I think New Hampshire does a better job with this than a lot of states, but certainly at a national level, having access to representation for folks who don't have it is so important. I get to work a lot with members of the New Hampshire Public Defender's Office. Mm-hmm. I think they're really good lawyers. I think a lot of times people feel like when they're getting a government lawyer to represent them that they're not getting the best advocate for them. I think, in my experience, that's not true. Our public defenders are really well trained. They're really good lawyers, and they work well in the system that we have. And it's a shame in some places in the country that you don't have access to that. But in New Hampshire, it's more or less tied to your ability to go to jail as a result of your charges. So at that level, that's when you end up getting the opportunity to have appointed counsel. And that's something that I just think is really important, because it's not even just a question of whether you go to jail or not. There are so many long-term consequences that come from your interaction with the justice system that you really should have somebody who knows what they're doing explain it to you. If it's a DUI, you get your first DUI and they tell you it's a misdemeanor level B, which is the lowest level criminal offense in New Hampshire. You get a fine, you have to lose your license for a little bit. But if they're not also clearly telling you that means that your second one is going to lead to an automatic jail sentence, or some of the other consequences that could come from that, then you're not going to be making an informed decision. Okay. Or if you're somebody who's an avid hunter and you take a felony conviction in the state of New Hampshire, understanding what that means to your ability to own and operate firearms is important. A lot of times people don't realize a lot of federal and state funds that are available to people are contingent on you having a clean criminal record, or at least a criminal record devoid of felonies. So having criminal record, a felony criminal record, and trying to get into some community nursing homes or get access to Section 8 federal housing can be really seriously impacted. So,
or college student loans.
Absolutely. That's a huge one that people don't realize, especially when we used to see over-policing of marijuana. Right. You'd get a felony marijuana possession as an 18-year-old, and all of a sudden you can't get the student loans that everybody else needs. And now you've really destroyed the opportunity to go forward. And I think some of the other things that you addressed are also really important. Gender equity and racial equity. Generally, I think you can't have a healthy and safe community without those. You can't have a well-functioning community that's operating to its fullest extent if there are people isolated or left behind. especially when it comes as a result of actions the government does. What that means from a justice system perspective, means that making sure that police officers have the right kind of training so that when they go into a domestic violence situation, they understand the mental aspect of how a battered spouse ends up in that situation. I think a lot of times it can be hard to deal with because you get the same call over and over again. He's hit me, he's hit me, he's hit me again. And a lot of times when you get away from that first incident of violence, you'll see that battered spouse recant or say because they apologize. Yeah. They try to move on, they try to move forward. And police officers, I understand the frustration, look at that happen over and over again and say I'm just not gonna take them seriously. But when you have the training on the victimology there and you realize that that's part of the cycle of control of individuals who are abusive, you can realize that you need to support those victims more than ever the 5th, 6th, and 7th time that they report, because that might be finally the time that they're able to break themselves out of that cycle. And that really goes to that issue of gender equity. A lot of times, unfortunately, the vast majority of domestic violence in our country is male and female partner abuse. And making sure that we're treating those people equally while we're going through that is going to make sure that we have better outcomes. And it's the same concept on the racial equity side. You don't ever want to have disparate outcomes for people who are otherwise the same, simply because one person is a minority and one person isn't. And I think a lot of people think we can achieve that through colorblind law enforcement or colorblind prosecution, where you just say, I'm just not going to worry about that. But you're really missing the systemic issues that lead you to that point in time. Yeah. When you're looking at it from a colorblind perspective. As a prosecutor and as a member of law enforcement, you should be saying, what were the drivers that got these two individuals here? And if individual one has a longer criminal record of offenses that if they were a different person, maybe would have been taken differently, then you can't just assume because one person has a longer criminal record than the other that they deserve a more serious punishment. Yeah. So, in order to tackle those issues, we really need to look behind what you see on a facial basis and really address those systemic issues.
We've covered a lot of ground, Steve. I've learned an awful lot about what the county attorney does. I hope you voters have learned a lot about who Steve Briden is. He's a candidate for the Rockingham County Attorney's job. And please make sure you get out and vote. Thank you very much, Steve. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, my pleasure.